The Magnet and the Empire, Kabul Airport, 2021, The Cunning of Reason and the Alternate Version of History, where the British never left Indian subcontinent in 1947. World history is the progress of the consciousness of freedom. G.W.F. Hegel, Lectures on the Philosophy of History. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of the struggle for material conditions. After Karl Marx. Part 1. The Tarmac and the Truth. The Kabul Paradox. The chaotic scenes at Hamid Karzai International Airport in August 2021 remain among the most haunting images of the 21st century. Afghans swarmed the tarmac, clung to the landing gear of departing American aircraft, and, in tragic cases, fell from the sky. These images captured a moment of raw desperation, but they captured something else too, something that conventional narratives consistently misread. This was not a celebration of liberation from foreign occupation, as Taliban ideologues had long promised it would be. It was a human tide surging towards the very power that had occupied the country for 20 years. The crowds were not cheering the Americans' departure, they were begging to join them. The standard global narrative framed the evacuation as a symbol of American decline, humanitarian tragedy, moral failure, the collapse of a fragile democracy, the betrayal of interpreters, civil servants, and loyal allies facing lethal Taliban retaliation. These risks were real and grave. Yet beneath that layer lay a more primal dynamic. Twist the lens slightly, and the airport crush reveals itself as something else entirely. A once-in-a-lifetime lottery ticket, and one that many had been waiting decades to draw. The Taliban's return was a terrifying catalyst, but for a great many of those who ran toward the plains, it provided convenient cover for a deeper, older yearning. The desire to trade lives of scarcity and uncertainty for lives of order and plenty. They were not merely fleeing the Taliban. They were seizing the Americans' ride home. The American withdrawal became, accidentally, an emigration pipeline. In that light, the tragedy was not only the betrayal of allies, but the narrowness of the door. Too few planes, too little time, too small a passage for a hunger rooted not in abstract politics, but in the brutal geography of fortune. The universal lottery. Consider a thought experiment. Suppose American passenger aircraft were to land tomorrow in the teeming cities of Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, or Sri Lanka, in Lahore, Dhaka, Mumbai, Colombo, and announce simply, "We are departing for North America, Australia, and Western Europe. Board if you wish." The resulting stampede would dwarf Kabul chaos by orders of magnitude, measured not in thousands, but in tens of millions. Entire populations would uproot. For the average young person in any of these cities, the Western liberal democratic state represents what earlier ages called El Dorado: reliable electricity, paved roads, salaried employment, functioning courts, free press, secular education for daughters, and a future in which children do not die of preventable diseases or stray bullets. A Pakistani carpenter today risks the Aegean in a dinghy, not for abstract freedom, but for German wages and a German pension. An Afghan engineer clung to a C-17 undercarriage, not for ideology, but for the world that C-17 was departing toward. The material magnet of Western modernity does not require propaganda. It speaks for itself in every remittance envelope and every visa queue. A second paradox, the guns and the stampede. A sharper paradox sharpened the scene. While Taliban fighters engaged American forces in sporadic clashes and asserted control over the perimeter, ordinary Afghans, families, young men, women clutching infants, rushed toward the American aircraft. The same movement that had battled the foreign occupier for 20 years now watched as the population it claimed to liberate voted with its feet against the restored emirate. This was not unified national resistance to empire. It was a stark cleavage between ideological and tribal militants on one side and a broader populace drawn by material possibility on the other. Both resistance and aspiration were visible in the same frame, and the aspiration pointed west. Afghanistan, before and after the American interlude. To grasp the depth of this yearning, one must understand what Afghan modernity actually meant, and how recently it had appeared. Pre-1979, Afghanistan was impoverished and largely tribal, but possessed a degree of fragile stability under the monarchy and the early republic. Limited modernization in Kabul, some secular education, and women's partial participation in urban life. The Soviet invasion of 1979 devastated what existed. Millions fled as refugees, infrastructure crumbled, agriculture collapsed, and a generation was radicalized through jihad backed by the United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. The civil wars of the 1990s and the first Taliban emirate reduced much of the country to conditions reminiscent of the medieval. Female education banned, cultural heritage destroyed, subsistence scarcity enforced as policy. The American period, 2001 to 2021, produced transformation, however fragile and unevenly distributed. From a shattered wasteland, Kabul evolved into a city of glass towers, traffic jams, shopping malls, universities, and a nascent professional class. Women studied engineering and medicine. Beauty salons and internet cafes appeared alongside a constitution, a parliament, and a bureaucracy. American money funded highways, ministries, airports, schools, and hospitals, not from altruism, but from counterinsurgency doctrine. Winning hearts and minds required visible progress. Development served security, but 20 years, barely a single generation, proved too brief for deep institutional rooting. This created a profound tension. The occupiers, demonized by traditionalists, had simultaneously become the agents of material modernity. And when they left, the modernity they had built proved too shallow-rooted to survive without them. Institutions require not just construction, but internalization, bureaucratic habit, rule of law as reflex rather than performance, educational culture across generations. Japan's Meiji Restoration succeeded because elites voluntarily adapted Western models out of ambition and existential necessity, across decades of disciplined effort. Afghanistan, caught between tribal honor codes and bureaucratic aspiration, between the madrasa and the university, remained in irresolvable tension. The 2021 images freeze a gap too wide to bridge in 20 years. Hegel's cunning of reason. Hegel's concept of the List der Vernunft, the cunning of reason, illuminates this history with uncomfortable clarity. History, Hegel argued, advances through the selfish passions, material interests, and strategic calculations of its actors, often producing outcomes larger than and contrary to their original intentions. Empires pursue domination or security and unwittingly disseminate institutions, consciousness, and modernity. Americans acted primarily out of self-interest, neutralizing Al-Qaeda, preventing future attacks, stabilizing a strategically vital region. The result, however unintended in scope, was an Afghanistan with modern infrastructure, a generation raised in contact with secular education and technical training, a cohort of English-speaking professionals who had internalized at least fragments of bureaucratic modernity. The dialectic advanced through American guns, dollars, and pragmatism, generating outcomes that exceeded the original war aim, and then receded, leaving those outcomes exposed and unsupported. This pattern has antecedents. Gibraltar, the Falklands, and Hong Kong never developed the clamorous independence movements that anti-colonial narratives predict as a universal law of empire. In 1982, Falkland Islanders pleaded for British warships against Argentine annexation. In 1997, many Hong Kong residents mourned the handover, rushed for British passports, and feared what Beijing's tightening control would bring. Prosperity, security, and the rule of law proved stronger bonds than any flag. When material conditions favour association over independence, nationalism reveals itself, in these cases at least, as what one might call a luxury belief, most attainable after basic security has already been secured. The Kabul tarmac was the inverse, the catastrophic withdrawal of material conditions that had briefly made modernity possible. Those who ran toward the plains understood, with the directness of the dispossessed, that what was departing was not merely an army, but a world. Part 2. The Empire that Endured. A thought experiment in historical counterfactual. The Kabul paradox raises a question that cuts deeper than Afghanistan. If prosperity reliably outweighs patriotism as a force binding populations to political arrangements, what follows for the history of empire itself? The British withdrawal from India in 1947 has been canonized as moral progress, the righting of an ancient wrong, the self-determination of hundreds of millions. But if the airport at Kabul teaches us anything, it is that material conditions shape loyalties at least as powerfully as ideology. The question then is not sentimental. It is structural. What if Britain had stayed? This is not advocacy. It is a thought experiment in the Hegelian mode, pressing historical logic to its conclusions to see what it reveals. Consider an alternate history in which Winston Churchill, in 1945, saw further than most. Churchill's gamble, 1945 to 1947. In our own timeline, the British Empire withdrew from India amid bankruptcy, war weariness, and moral exhaustion. In this alternate one, Churchill recognised in 1945 that the real struggle was only beginning. The Soviet Union loomed over Asia. Stalin's influence was pressing towards the Khyber Pass. To Churchill, abandoning India was not liberation. It was surrender of the most consequential kind. The Washington Mission, America's unlikely alliance and the Iron Curtain. In early 1946, Churchill crossed the Atlantic to meet President Harry S. Truman and senior American officials. Behind closed doors, Churchill unfolded a large map across the conference table. His finger moved from Eastern Europe to Central Asia. In his famous, now modified, Iron Curtain speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, on March 5, 1946, he said, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. But today I must warn of an even greater shadow falling across Asia. From the Caucasus through Iran and Afghanistan toward the Khyber Pass, Soviet influence advances. Imagine Britain withdraws from India. What follows? A divided subcontinent, competing national governments, religious violence, weak institutions, economic collapse. Communist parties will exploit disorder. Moscow will not need to invade India. It will simply wait for instability to invite intervention. British India possesses enormous manpower, modern ports, industrial capacity, oil routes, and direct access to the Indian Ocean. If we abandon it, we surrender Asia's centre of gravity to tyranny." American listened carefully. Later, one senior official observed quietly, "You are asking us to support the continuation of the British Empire." Churchill smiled. "No, I am asking you to preserve the foundation upon which the free world shall defend itself." For several weeks, American intelligence agencies produced strategic assessments. Their conclusions surprised even Truman. If India descended into civil war or political fragmentation, Soviet influence could eventually spread toward the Indian Ocean. The implications for Middle Eastern oil, Southeast Asia, and global trade were enormous. The Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, the Indian Ocean shipping lanes, all would be vulnerable to communist pressure. Washington therefore adopted an unexpected policy. The United States publicly announced that Britain's continued administration of India was justified on strategic grounds until communist expansion had been contained. More importantly, elements of the Marshall Plan were extended to British India as an Asian recovery program, pouring billions in American capital, machinery, technical advisors, and food aid into the subcontinent to build economic resilience and deny communists the weapon of poverty. US support also included intelligence sharing, naval cooperation, and diplomatic backing for measures to maintain stability. The declaration stunned journalists across the world. Newspapers in London, Delhi, Karachi, Moscow, and New York carried the story on their front pages. Many expected the British Empire to begin dissolving after the war. Instead, it appeared to have gained the support of the world's newest superpower. For the first time, the empire had not just a British mandate, but an American endorsement. Washington, already alarmed by Soviet moves in Eastern Europe, agreed. The United States publicly endorsed Britain's continued administration of India on national security grounds, pending the stabilization of the communist threat. Congress and Muslim League leaders, expecting independence, erupted in protest. Strikes, marches, and civil disobedience swept Bombay, Calcutta, Delhi, and Lahore. London responded with what planners called Operation Iron Shield. Troops secured railways, ports, and communications infrastructure. Emergency powers were imposed. Key organisers were detained. The British Indian Army, professional and largely loyal, held. Organised mass resistance was broken within months. Churchill understood, however, that force was merely a holding measure. Speaking to Parliament, he declared, "We will not merely govern India, we will enrich it." Thus began what his administration called the Imperial Development Initiative, the most ambitious state investment programme in British history. Railways were electrified and extended. Steel plants, hydroelectric dams, motorways, universities, and scientific institutes rose across the subcontinent. British manufacturing firms relocated production. Scholarships dispatched thousands of young Indians to Oxford, Cambridge, and London. They returned as engineers, administrators, and managers. London committed to transforming British India not into an extraction colony, but into the industrial heart of the Commonwealth. The Gibraltar Principle. Economic loyalty in practice history had already hinted at this outcome. The populations of Gibraltar, the Falklands, and Hong Kong never developed significant independence movements, not because they were coerced into loyalty, but because the material terms of association outweighed the psychic appeal of sovereignty. Falkland Islanders in 1982 pleaded for British warships against Argentine annexation. Hong Kong residents in 1997 mourned the handover, bought British passports in anticipation of flight, and feared what Beijing's sovereignty would bring. Prosperity, security, and the rule of law proved, in each case, a more durable bond than nationalist sentiment. In this alternate timeline, Britain applied what might be called the Hong Kong model at continental scale. Strong property rights, a common law judiciary, open trade policy, and free port commercial arrangements. By the mid-1950s, Punjabi farmers earned substantially more than their counterparts in our timeline's independent Pakistan. Bengali clerks in Calcutta enjoyed pensions and sterling accounts. Gujarati merchants traded under imperial preferences across a network stretching from Singapore to Dubai to London. Afghans, Nepalis, and Burmese migrant workers flowed into the Dominion rather than away from it. Delhi and Bombay became magnets rather than way stations, offering British schools, legal protections, and access to a global commercial network. The Promised Land was no longer exclusively Europe. It existed, scaled down but real, within the Dominion itself. the fading of nationalism, 1950s to 1960s. The independence movements faced an increasingly impossible rhetorical situation. Jawaharlal Nehru might still demand Swaraj in 1955, but a Bombay mill owner would interrupt with practical questions. Would India retain imperial trade preferences? Would the Royal Navy protect its shipping lanes? Would children continue to attend Cambridge on government scholarships? Political rhetoric could not easily compete with rising wages, electrification, urban development, and civil stability. Britain, having learned from its earlier miscalculations, the American colonies in 1776, Ireland in 1922, devolved substantial local governance to provincial parliaments, both Hindu and Muslim, while retaining control over defence, foreign policy, and currency. This was federal empire rather than crude colonialism. Local elites gained genuine power without bearing the crushing fiscal and security costs of full sovereignty. A Pakistani general in our own world spends heavily on an army perpetually struggling against insurgents along contested frontiers. His counterpart in British India focuses instead on local administration, while London underwrites naval defence and external security guarantees. By 1960, the first post-war generation of Indian professionals, educated in Britain and returned as managers rather than revolutionaries, surveyed the global landscape with clear eyes. They watched most of the African countries descending into chaos soon: civil wars, military coups after gaining independence, Vietnam burn, and Burma slide into military dictatorship. Their own dominion offered stability, multi-faith civil order, and upward mobility within a functioning legal and commercial framework. Congress rebranded itself as a social welfare lobby, pressing for more hospitals and more schools. The Muslim League became a devolution party operating within the imperial framework. The Quit India radicals of an earlier generation now filed their taxes and bought suburban properties. Nationalism became a cultural pastime for poets and political theorists, while the professional middle class defended the crown because their children studied at Oxford, their savings were safe, and the alternative, visible in newly independent neighbours, was disorder. The Gibraltar effect proved decisive. When the material benefits of association exceed the psychic appeal of nationhood, loyalty follows prosperity, not ideology. The 2026 mirror, what the counterfactual reveals. Look at the actual world of 2026. Migrants from Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka undertake desperate and frequently fatal journeys to Europe, across the Aegean in rubber dinghies, in lorry containers through Turkey and the Balkans, not for ideology, and not, in most cases, for political asylum in any meaningful sense, but for wages, institutional reliability, physical safety, and their children's futures. A labourer from Lahore earns a fraction locally of what he can remit home from London or Hamburg. The Irish did the same in 1847. The Italians did the same in 1950. The calculus is not political, it is economic. In the alternate timeline, that calculus shifts inward. British India becomes the economic magnet. Massive infrastructure investment, rail, roads, ports, industry, mirrors Hong Kong's developmental success, but at continental scale. Afghanistan, under stronger British-American strategic influence, sees railroads, secular education, and industrial development rather than the jihad pipeline of our own history. South Asia industrializes rapidly and without the interruption of partition's catastrophic violence. Internal migration replaces the desperate outward flight that characterizes our timeline. When a British politician in London floats the idea of full sovereignty in the 1970s, Indian stock markets shudder, the rupee trembles, and the editorial pages of newspapers from Karachi to Madras run headlines demanding continuation. Marches take place, not for independence but against it. A referendum on separation fails decisively, as it did in Quebec in 1995, as it did in Scotland in 2014. Populations vote with their feet, and their feet stay put. The economics of loyalty, the underlying argument. This alternate history rests on a single hard lesson. Economic dependence, when it operates through a framework of rights and opportunity rather than naked extraction, is the most durable dependence of all. A nation with a shattered economy, weak institutions, and a fleeing professional class is not free in any meaningful sense. It is merely ungoverned. Its people will leave at the first opportunity, as Afghans left in 2021. As Pakistanis leave today, as Syrians and Yemenis leave in their hundreds of thousands. A prosperous dominion with rising wages, secure rights, global trade networks, and external security guarantees is a fortress of contentment. Citizens may compose patriotic verses, but they ultimately defend the hand that feeds them, educates their daughters, and keeps the hospitals open. The British Empire in our own timeline was too often extractive, draining resources, suppressing industry, and maintaining racial hierarchies that undermined the legitimacy of association. What this thought experiment explores is a different version, a developmental empire made so under Cold War pressure and the logic of geopolitical competition, one that discovered prosperity as a superior adhesive to coercion. The people of South Asia do not flee poor neighbours for nothing. They seek Europe for everything that poor neighbours cannot provide. In this alternate timeline, British India is that Europe, stable, opportunity-rich, integrated into a global commercial and legal network. The Kabul airport, viewed through this lens, is not an anomaly. It is the expression of a universal law. Empty stomachs and collapsing hospitals make poor nationalists. When the Americans departed Kabul, they took modernity with them, or at least the fragment of modernity they had briefly installed. Those who ran after the planes understood this, with the terrible clarity of people who have seen the alternative. They were not running from the Taliban precisely. They were running toward a world. Conclusion: the cunning of reason revisited. Hegel's cunning of reason does not promise efficiency. It does not guarantee justice. It operates through suffering, miscalculation, and historical irony on a grand scale. Empires built for extraction sometimes cede the institutions of self-governance. Wars launched for self-interest sometimes produce modernity. Withdrawals intended as liberation sometimes produce catastrophe. The direction is not linear, and the beneficiaries are not always those intended. What the Kabul tarmac and this thought experiment share is a common argument, that material conditions are primary, and that when political arrangements deliver security, opportunity, and institutional reliability, they generate loyalties that outlast any flag. The desperate run towards the plains was neither pure tragedy nor simple triumph. It was a raw testament to human aspiration operating within historical dialectics that no individual chose and no individual controlled. The harvest of modernity, whether under American tutelage in Afghanistan or under an imagined developmental British Empire in South Asia, may come later, much later, shaped by the same cunning reason that operates through self-interest toward unintended, often progressive ends. The tarmac images are not the final word. They are a marker in the long struggle between old worlds and new ones, between what exists and what human beings, in their millions, continue to reach for.